Welcome back. I'm Helen Collis. I'm one of Politico Europe's healthcare journalists. Our next discussion is going to look at how resilient Europe is to health and economic shocks when it comes to medicine supply chains and strategic autonomy. But first, some housekeeping. Do please tweet about our event using the hashtag #PoliticoHealthcare, and I'll be happy to take your questions if you can send them through on the swap card platform to the right of your screen on a desktop and below the live stream if you're using your mobile. Joining me today on the panel, we have in person Cristian Silviu Bușoi, Romanian MEP with the EPP. Welcome.
Hello.
Philippe Dreschel, Vice President of Generics Europe at Teva. Welcome. And Nicolas Frédéric Poitier, a Research Fellow from Bruegel. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, Europe has been facing medicine supply shortages for many years, but it was the pandemic that really shone a light on just how dependent Europe is to imported medicines and active ingredients. Today, we've got the added pressures of soaring energy prices, high inflation from the war in Ukraine. It's quite an unprecedented time for any manufacturing sector. But first, Philippe, can you set the scene for us? What proportion of Teva's medicines are manufactured overseas, outside of Europe today, and what impact did this have on fulfilling orders during the pandemic?
Yeah, so thanks, Helen, for the question, and I'll answer on two levels. So first of all, on the finished product level, we are out of Europe. We are still sourcing over 90% of our finished products. So we have a very strong footprint in Europe. We have many manufacturing sites in Italy, in Germany, in Spain, in Croatia, in the Czech Republic, etc., etc. So we have a very strong manufacturing footprint, and on the finished pack level, it's 90%. On the API, so the active ingredient level, it is 40 to 45%, which might sound low, but it's actually super high. Yeah, we have a very high footprint in Europe, also on the API manufacturing side. So the footprint is important. And maybe to your question, what has the pandemic learned us out of the footprint we have? I would say, first of all, we were, as a company, actually taking good advantage of our European footprint. I would say as an industry as well. So the industry has proven that it was up to the challenge, even if the challenge was quite important. But we also realized, and we have to be very, very clear on that on some products there's been shortages and issues. And we all heard about the paracetamol, where suddenly India started to stop the exportation, and there was a lot of tension. So there are examples that are showing that we have to be careful in the way we are sourcing products, but we also have to be balanced in the way we are sourcing products.
Mm-hmm. Cristian, what's your view on here? Do you feel like Europe's lost its competitive edge, for example, in medicines manufacturing? Is there too much reliance on other countries?
Yes, this is clear for us, the policymakers, that unfortunately, in the past 25 years, Europe lost part of the production capacities, production capabilities, and also increased its dependence of manufacturing sites outside the European Union. For raw materials, for instance, but also for affordable generic medicines, we are very much depending on Asia, and especially a few production sites in Asia. For innovative medicines, even that Europe has a large potential, a lot of skills, clearly, unfortunately, now most of the innovation comes from United States, our main strategic partner, but still, even being in a strong partnership, we need to have our own innovative capacity, and also more and more other parts of the world. That's why European Parliament, and especially the committee that I'm chairing, I'm the President of Industry, Research and Energy Committee, welcomed very much the pharmaceutical industry. The topic of our discussion aligned very much with the industrial industry, but also with the Green Deal and with the EU Beating Cancer Plan and the digital strategy of European Union. Some of the solutions are legislative, and we are waiting to see the two legislative proposals. Well, the third is the FIS, European Medicine Agency, but the new role of European Medicine Agency and of course the orphan and pediatric medicine. We are working now on the health data space, the previous issue discussed. I'm the rapporteur in ITRE committee and we are working in several committees, still not yet solved the conflict of competencies, but clearly we'll have a strong saying there because we need a clear framework for utilization of data. Of course, primary is very important, but the secondary is extremely important for research, for clinical trials. So we need to give clear incentives, national and European, to companies to invest more and to build production seats in Europe. This is one. The second, to simplify the procedures, to reduce bureaucracy, to fasten the procedures at the European Medicine Agency, give them the necessary resources, but also the member states to have faster access to innovation and to bring innovation closer, and also to strengthen the IP rights, the intellectual property rights. This is very important for the innovation part. In the same time, of course, we have to increase the use of generic medicines, biosimilars, affordable medicines, and also to build production sites of these medicines in Europe. I know several countries very eager to do so, including my country, Romania, but clearly something needs to be done on legislative front and on non-legislative front, and send to member states a clear signal that we need to act. Otherwise, what we see now in energy, we can see tomorrow in the production of medicines.
That's a very comprehensive list of all the things that we're going to be exploring this afternoon. Nicholas, I'd love to bring you in and get your response to some of these measures. What do you think about the current situation and the resiliency of supply of medicines in Europe? Do we have a problem here? And what do you think, if we have got a problem, what do you think are the main causes of that?
So I think first of all, I would start with a much more optimistic view than my previous speaker. The European medical industry is very strong, internationally very competitive. If we think, for instance, that vaccines that became so important before the pandemic, about 44% of vaccines that were exported in the world were produced by the EU, were exported by the EU. So we're really strong here. I think the challenge that we see is much more on the side of, do we have specific products where we are dependent on imports, and then in this case, like a pandemic, we can see export restrictions like we saw on paracetamol in India, like we saw on some vaccine stuff. So I think here really the challenge is to figure out which are things that might be in shortage and where we need intervention, while at the same time not undermining our own competitiveness. Because one risk that is that if we think about some dependencies which are on API and some ingredients, raw materials, is that basically the access to these raw materials at an affordable price is something that is a competitive advantage for our own industry. And if we now impose something like tariffs or heavy rules on this, we might actually harm our own competitiveness in this industry. But I also would like to say that there's a bit of a myth that basically doing everything at home would make us much more resilient. We've seen, for instance, in the case of infant formula in the United States, where they did shortage because they imposed so strong restrictions on domestic production that they barely had any imports. And when then one of the few producers they had in the US, one of 4 producers, had a problem, basically they had a shortage in the US, which no one else experienced. Of course, if you can access global markets, you have much more diversity, meaning also you can import from many other places, making the import, if you have a local shock, more resilient. The only problem is, of course, if we have a global shock and then we have a global response, a breakdown of markets, because some countries might close their borders.
Very interesting. Philippe, I'd like to get your response to the remark there about this sort of myth about homegrown products are going to protect resiliency. What's Teva's response been to the pandemic with regards to manufacturing things in Europe? Has it further invested as a result of any sort of supply issues that it's faced? Or is it looking for support or policy incentives to reshore some of those processes that have gone overseas?
Yeah, so maybe to answer your question on whether Teva is investing in Europe, absolutely yes. We are, as we speak, finalizing the manufacturing of a biopharmaceutical site in Germany. We have invested 1 billion. We're investing in many other European sites. So yes, we are committed to investing in our European basis, this for sure. We are also participating in the IPCI. We are in that process to understand how this is working and if we can gain access. So we are taking, of course, a strategic approach to our European footprint. You're also asking whether we have changed our view on things after and before the pandemic. I would say not fundamentally, because we were always committed to Europe as a very strong region to manufacture. And maybe to your point, Niklas, reshoring everything into Europe, I think I would strongly agree. That's not the solution, right? Pharmaceutical production is very, very complex. It needs the global approach, right? But I think it's all about the balance where you get a full dependency on a given country, whether it's China or India or any other country, right, or region. That becomes really, really dangerous. So it's all about mitigating the risk. And to be honest, what we've seen, and this is where I'm joining also Christian, is that over the years, manufacturing has moved from Europe to Asia. And the pandemic has actually shown some very interesting statements. For example, in Germany, where politicians in Germany said, "How comes? Germany used to be the pharmaceutical plant of the world, and now we are dependent and we are not self-sufficient." And the actions behind those words and the reactions still need to be seen. So we are seeing very little action so far on a political level in response to the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the IPCI or IPCI project for investing in innovation. Nicholas, what's your ideas around that? Is this the right approach to almost like swerve state aid rules, if you like, to really kind of bring back manufacturing of commodity medicines?
So I think the problem with that approach, or one of the problematic things about this approach, is that the IPCI is fundamentally a research and innovation development project. So the state aid rules that we have, they don't allow to build capacity at home. They allow to explore new process innovation, new innovation in the products, and that's what it's meant to support. The problem is that we see now that in many more industries, these rules are somehow weakened, because what the EU actually wants to do, and many member states wants to do, is to build capacity on things that have moved away. And these are often things that are in the lower end of the spectrum of complexity. So there's a bit of a problem that on the one hand we have restrictive rules on what we can finance with ICPI, which might not really match with what we might want to finance. And the result is that we weaken somehow the rules and we don't really get what we want. So I think here really the challenge is to adapt the ICPI to the needs and to think of other instruments that might be more suited to this. So if we look, for instance, at the health ICPIs, we don't know about the scale and the projects yet. I think in the healthcare sector, unlike other ICPI sector, the public interest in giving subsidy to the sector is very clear. With batteries or something like this, it's much less clear. The public interest in having a functioning car manufacturing is not as clear as having a functioning healthcare system. But here we have to make sure that this money is well spent. It's public money that will go to private actors, and here we need the right kind of transparency and rules and enforcement of these rules. And this is something we have not seen in the IPCIs in the past. In the past, it basically has been up to DG Comp to make sure that they are enforced, but there has been very little transparency in how this money is actually spent, and it actually reaches these goals. Mm-hmm. And especially on this kind of commoditized generica or the APIs, it's not really clear if they can actually manage with the current framework at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Christian, what's your thought about that this project is being used to build up capacity as opposed to really further investing in innovative projects in the healthcare sector?
I can echo some of the things already said here. Clearly, could be a good opportunity, but it's not enough. And sometimes we have initiatives that do not respond to all the situations and all the challenges that we have to face. Clearly, we have some instruments at the EU level. We made sure also that in Horizon Europe, we have some opportunities, of course, for research. This could be also good and a good incentive for the innovative companies to bring here production seats if they have a lot of research opportunities from European funds. I was the rapporteur also of EU for Health. There, of course, is not direct grants to companies, but to some strategies could be financed, and of course, some reforms could be discussed under this framework. Very important is that RRF, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, could be used by the member states in order to give some incentives also for new production capacities in the healthcare domain. I'm not sure how many use this, but clearly could be helpful, as all the projects in digitalization could be also interesting for pharma companies, generic or innovative, to use these opportunities and to complement their investments in order to increase the investment level in Europe. On the costs side front, of course, it's difficult to compete still with some countries in Asia. On the regulatory side, Europe is seen, and with some correctness, as difficult and having a lot of barriers. This is one of the key expectations of European Parliament for the initiatives and the legislation to reduce bureaucracy, to simplify rules. Of course, taking into account a lot of ethical, a lot of principles that GDPR, personal data protection, everything that we built during the years, but clearly the timeline and the requirements should be very much simplified. But we have many advantages. We have strong universities, we have strong and very good researchers, we have a strong industrial base. Let's use these opportunities in order to... It's difficult to bring back from there, but clearly the need for medicines in the future will increase. So idea is to have additional production seats here in Europe, and with this we will increase our autonomy and decrease the dependence.
Thank you. I want to touch on one of the things that you've mentioned a couple of times, which is that the regulatory environment for medicines. Philippe, is Europe's regulatory environment, is it competitive enough for the world stage for generic sectors to be producing in Europe? Or is it considered more of a hurdle to set up a facility here?
Yeah, before I answer that question, I just want to come back on the IPCI. I need to say that because we should not exclude generics from the IPCI. And why? Because greening and digitizing the production is actually very innovative. And greening it on essential medicines can be a strategic importance. So let's not just say the IPCI is for the fancy innovation. Maybe it's a little bit more boring in that sense, but it is super important that essential medicines can be produced in a green way and in a digitized, efficient way in Europe. Also thinking about the environmental challenges that we have ahead of us in Europe. So that's more on the IPCI. Now, on your question on the regulatory environment, there is a lot to do. I think Christian mentioned, right? The environment today is it's still analog, so there's a lack of digitized approach to it. We are very much favoring more digital approaches. I want to talk about the e-leaflet, the electronic leaflet, for example. We are really fighting as an industry to get it through, and the reason is very simple, right? It's because you are gaining a great level of flexibility when it comes to moving products across the borders, if that's needed. But you also have an up-to-date leaflet, for example, and also environmentally speaking, it's a very nice thing to do because, I'm just talking about my company. If we could get rid of the leaflets, this is the equivalent of, 500 million liters of water per year. It's the equivalent of 9,000 cars that are driving around, and I can give you many more KPIs on this. So it's a good thing to do, for example. So I think we do have some improvements to be made at the regulatory level. Absolutely.
And sticking with you, Philippe, I'd like to find out what investors think about investing in commodity, sort of low profit margin products like generics in Europe. What's the mood among investors for reshoring or building up further capacity for generics in Europe? We've obviously got very high energy costs and more expensive labour market than our neighbours in China and Asia, for example. So what's the sort of investor sentiment there?
Yeah, so I would say the investor sentiment is that there is, of course, generics is an attractive business, and the reason is simply because there is a need for generics. It's a basic need. We are really ensuring access of medication to patients, and it's also, of course, a business that is sustainable. But that is becoming under pressure. That is for sure. And we need to look at this also in a very cautious and balanced way. You mentioned, Helen, the inflation, which of course is a concern. Yeah, we see energy prices going up, and what we also see, of course, is on the other side there is a pressure. Coming from a pricing perspective, you would expect, that inflation would trigger a discussion around, can we do something about pricing? If I want to be honest, in some areas it goes the other way around. And I will give you a few examples as we speak, and I know close to your heart the whole VPAS discussion in the UK, which is the clawback system. We know governments are under pressure, the budgets are under pressure after COVID, and they're trying to look for savings. What I'm saying here is, what we see in terms of VPAS, clawbacks, we see the same in France with the PLFSS, where the clawback is, the politicians are talking about increasing the clawbacks. We see in Germany, tenders are all about pricing. There is no other criteria than pricing. So this is concerning, and I'm calling here to also all the decision makers that they shouldn't shoot at the ambulance, because we are here to help generating savings. We are here for the access of medicines, and we need to be careful. So I'm not concerned, because I'm always very hopeful, and just to draw the line, our investors and financial investors interested in the generics, yes, they are, because again we are an attractive industry, but we have to be careful, yeah, and we need to make sure that this industry remains attractive for everybody.
And Nicholas, what's your thoughts on the other side of the supply chain here? Do governments need to sit down and look at how they are paying for generic medicines and tying them into reference pricing systems and rebate schemes along with innovative pharma? Is there a need to have a look at those contracts?
So I think indeed. So the question is really, there's the cost side and there's the resilience side again. And I think if we think about the resilience of supply, we have to be very, very targeted, very specific of what we want to achieve. And for some things, it might be just enough to stockpile them. Something like PPE that you don't really need to do any big state aid. For some things, something just giving state aid to a particular project, making sure that if this is a very complicated project that it's developed, might be a helpful approach. But very often it is basically the reason that we outshort generic production is not to do with the problem of fixed investment costs or research and innovation costs. It's really about the production cost. And here we have to look at the kind of levers that we have that we want, if we want to change something there. If we think that in specific products that we want to diversify the supply chain, procurement could be one way to do that, to make sure that not all the contracts go to one country or one company. I would always want to emphasize that the competitiveness and the price element in there has to be important for two reasons. The one reason is simply that we're aging as a society, that we are that our healthcare costs are just automatically going to go up and up and up, and there are going to more and more costs that are going to go into the system by itself. And how do you manage this cost if you have to be strategic about where you invest, where you're willing to pay a markup for maybe a localized production? The second reason is basically that with all these interventions in the market, there's always the risk for political maneuvering, for lobbying, for graft. And this is one problem that we have with these big industrial subsidies, that the transparency of the projects sometimes means that we're not entirely sure how member states decide which project gets approved, how much lobbying was in there, how do they calculate the investment needs of companies and subsidy means. And the more we do this might be necessary in some cases, but the more we do this and more money, the weaker we make the price argument, the more we create an economy, a political economy that might be problematic.
Mm-hmm. And Christian, do you want to come in on the pricing debate here? Do you think, would Romania be interested in letting the generic sector price its drugs a bit higher, for example, to cater for these extra costs?
Well, for this, you would need the Minister of Health of Romania. Of course, we are colleagues. We discussed many times this issue. I know the discussions about clawback and about the system of having the lowest price in Europe, because it's the lowest price of a basket of 12 countries, and most of the countries are Central and East European countries. Clearly here it is a disadvantage, and we need to revise this, either to increase with the inflation rate, because this is something that we could do, at least the most targeted generics and those who are extremely under pressure. On the other hand, of course, to reduce gradually, to continue to reduce, because we did reduce and separate the clawback between innovative medicines and generics and biosimilar, and even national producted, to continue to reduce the clawback. In the same time, what I think is very important, and what I know from having a long and positive dialogue with the industry, is to try to get a win-win situation. Of course, it's clear that the industry should acknowledge the situation in each member state, the sustainability of some measures, what is affordable, what not, and of course the need to offer to the patients the necessary cures. On the other hand, they demand, of course, clear rules, a stable environment, long-term vision, and this is something that is still not in place in many member states. Pricing is a very important issue. This is the main reason, in my opinion, for instance, why we don't see many solutions for antimicrobial resistance, for new antibiotics, as the current framework philosophy of pricing and going to auctions and the lowest price do not give anyone the incentive to invest in new solutions, and we need new antibiotics in order to tackle the antimicrobial resistance. This is one of the causes of shortage, medicine shortage, not the only one. There are many, and we can enter into this discussion. But this could be compensated on a long-term vision and a honest partnership.
I just want to stay with you, Christian. Nicholas talked about needing to have targeted measures and a targeted approach, and looking at specific products that might need more resiliency in their supply chains. The European Commission has told us that it's now reviewing the 53,000 medicines that are currently in use in Europe, and it's looking to develop a list of the most essential ones and to map out strategic dependencies where it might be necessary to increase Europe's manufacturing capacity. I just wanted to get your reaction to that approach. Does that sound like a good approach for you?
Yes, for clear. First, we need to know what is the most critical. We need to map. We need to concentrate, because we cannot solve all the dependencies or to concentrate on everything in the same time. This is not the only dependence that we have, the only vulnerability. As president of ITRE committee, we discuss a lot about chips. And some of the ideas could be also used in other areas. So here, of course, to invest in new capacities, to give the right incentives, to invest in innovation, we can do also in research and innovation. We could use also in the pharma sector. In the chips also, one of the key elements of the strategy is to build durable partnerships with those countries, like-minded countries, where they could develop some of these products. If we look to the energy, we want to get rid of Russian imports, and we'll do it in the coming years. For this, we need to incentivize other partners, beside the fact that we need to reduce the consumption of gas and invest in renewables, in solar, in wind, in hydrogen, and to gain more energy efficiency. But we need to incentivize other countries to give them long-term contracts to increase the production capacity, to build new LNG terminals, to build new pipelines in order to give us. This is also for our dependency in the pharma, for raw materials, for some of, if we do long-term contracts, if we do agreements, and where we cannot invest here in Europe, it is not worth, it is not interest for European companies, not much added value. But there we could incentivize to invest and to have a more reliable partner, and what was said, very important, not to depend on the single sources. This is a lesson that we will learn very painful this winter and next winter in the energy sector. And once again, in some extent, we learned during the COVID, first with the mask, with the ventilators, and then with the vaccines, more or less. Let's not do the same mistake for essential medicines and not only.
Okay, thank you. And Philippe, I'd like to get your response to also the Commission review of these 53,000 medicines. If TAVR drugs are, for example, on those lists and are deemed necessary for further manufacturing capacity, what do you think the approach should be? What should be the obligation on industry? Are you looking for incentives or some kind of policy to help you along with that process?
Yes. So look, I'm less of a believer in obligations, but more in incentives. And I'll give you an example, and I think it was mentioned also by you, Niklas, to some extent. And I'm going to ask a question to the audience in a few minutes, so get prepared on that. If we take the example of a drug like tamoxifen. Tamoxifen is a drug that is used to treat breast cancer. It's a very essential medicine. It's hormone-based therapy. And what we've seen in recent months is a supply disruption. It was not a full shortage because the industry worked a lot on mitigating, but it was a super tense situation. And the reason why it was a super tense situation is because the last API supplier in Europe decided to stop production for economic reasons, and all the manufacturing of API is now in Eastern Europe. Now I'm going to ask the audience, what do you think is the treatment price of a pack of 100 tablets of tamoxifen? That's the equivalent of 3 months treatment. What would you just be brave and just say a number?
Any brave people?
If you don't know,
shout
just
out.
Google and...
You can Google or whatever. I don't give you so much time to do it, so...
Reveal to us, Philippe.
Yeah, I'll reveal it to you. So the reimbursed price in Germany for that drug is €9, not even €9, 8.8 euro for a treatment, which is 3 months. So that means a €3 treatment per month. And this is where we have ended up, right? This is the race to the bottom, and that's the result. And I believe more in the fact that maybe giving a fair price to that drug will give sufficient incentive for the industry to operate. Obligations will probably lead to even worse situations. We are seeing, we have this discussion around stockpiling. Great idea, right? We stockpile, product is available. What does it mean, stockpiling? It means you are disrupting somehow the existing network, manufacturing network. You're also creating an additional burden to some extent to manufacturers. So you're actually creating an even bigger hurdle. And maybe even more companies will decide to leave. So we need to be careful with obligations. We need to look at incentives. I think the list of medicines that are being monitored is a good starting point, right? We should look at the critical areas, but let's be careful in the way we are actually tackling the solution.
And Niklas, you're nodding. Would you like to come in response to that?
Yeah, so I think as an economist, the truth about medicine prices, it's not something that necessarily traded on stock markets, so you don't really have a price mechanism as another, like in oil and gas, so that make it very different. But I think on the one hand, it's something great that something life-saving potentially is so cheap. So it's something I think we should celebrate, and it's something that we need in our medical system to keep it affordable. The problem, of course, is what happens if we see suddenly a disruption like this. And here, I think the best way to deal with it is really diversity, to make sure that we have many different sources, that we don't just rely on one particular manufacturer that might sit in Europe or somewhere else, that might decide to shut down or not to shut down, might have a problem in the US with the infant formula. It was basically, I think it was a health problem that they had in their factory. Something like this may lead to a breakdown. So the best way to deal with that is really to make sure we have a broad range of suppliers, and that is something that the industry has to do, but also something where on the other hand the legislators have to make sure the incentives are there. Of course, I think in the end of the day, we should be careful with anything like friendshoring or something like this as well. Because as we've seen with India is a country people look to friendshore from China away, but then India was a country that imposed some export restrictions. And in the pandemic, we've seen everyone is the closest to themselves. We were really, I think, I'm very happy that we managed in Europe to keep our borders open, but that was not the norm internationally. And therefore, I think we should be careful here to assume that some countries might be more reliable, which in a crisis they might not be. So I think really here the challenge is on the one hand to make sure we diversify, to make sure we understand, to look at targeted products, which are the important ones, to exactly this problem of stockpiling that you mentioned, that basically all policy solutions have some caveats. And for each particular product, they might be different. For each product, what is the approach that achieves the most, that is the cheapest, and that doesn't lead to many externalities that might be negative. And maybe just last thing, I think we should be careful for what we wish for. And we've seen in this chips industry, which here really got caught into the public eye, that suddenly we went from we want to build a competitive chips industry to export restrictions all over the place. And I think that is something that is very damaging for the chips industry. And this is something I think we would want to avoid in the pharmaceutical industry. If we get to a point where everyone imposes Europe first, America first, China first policies, then we have a problem. So I think also here as a European, we should think about what happens when we impose this measure, how we can make sure that other people don't copy us, and what does the world look like if they do.
Thank you. That's brought us to the end of our time this afternoon. I want to thank our panelists for joining me, Nicholas, Philippe, and Christian. I think we've heard that it's a very complex issue. We have many thousands of medicines in use across Europe, and some of them are facing increasing supply shortages. It's clear that we need to perhaps diversify some of those supply chains, but picking the winners and how we do it through incentives or obligations is yet to be decided. But there are some positive notes here. Perhaps a greener industry in Europe might make it a bit more competitive in the long run. Thank you very much to all my panelists and for joining us online and in the room. We now have a 30-minute networking break. After that, we return at 3:50 for our next panel on non-communicable non-communicable diseases, a conversation on healthcare's silent killers moderated by Sarah Taizir Ben Sharif. Thank you. Thank you.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.